I'm Maureen Bunyan, and I am your host this afternoon for a discussion presented by the Netherland-America Foundation. The foundation, or NAF as it's known, was created to strengthen the ties of heritage and values shared by the people of the Netherlands and the United States. And we congratulate NAF this year on a milestone. NAF is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. I am a retired news broadcaster here in Washington, D.C., and I'm also a daughter of Guyana, the country about which is the subject of our discussion. Both of my parents were born and raised in Guyana, and although I was born in Aruba, I have Dutch nationality, so I was fascinated when I learned about this new book, Blood on the River, The Untold Story of the Berbice Slave Rebellion, a Chronicle of Mutiny and Freedom on the Wild Coast, published by the New Press. And we're very happy to have its author, Professor Marjoleine Kars, with us today. Professor Kars is Dutch. She teaches early American, Atlantic, and women's history and slavery at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. She has been widely praised for this book. And Professor Kars, if we have time later in this program, we hope to take questions from our viewers and our audience. Let's start, though, however, with giving us a little bit of a background, Professor Kars. Many people are not familiar with the role of the Dutch in South America. Some have familiarity, of course, with the role of the Dutch in Indonesia, in the Dutch Caribbean, but not so much in Guyana, in Suriname, and other parts of the Caribbean coast, as well as other parts of South America. Give us a little bit of a history of the Dutch involvement in these countries.
Absolutely. Let me start, though, if you don't mind, Maureen, by thanking NAF and everybody who is attending on their lunch breaks, and particularly Jim Dijkstra and Stan Veuger, as well as yourself for hosting me. The Dutch were actually early adopters of the Caribbean, if you can put it that way. The Dutch had a short-lived colony in what is now Brazil in the 17th century. They were only there for about 30 years, but they got very involved in the slave trade and in sugar production. And after they got kicked out of Brazil by the Portuguese, many of them moved to the Caribbean. By then, what later became Guyana had already been started. The first Dutch colony was started there in the 1620s in what is now, what later became Berbice. So Berbice was started just slightly after New Netherland, really, in North America. And it was initially owned by a private family from Zeeland. They introduced slavery there, they introduced sugar cultivation. In the early 18th century, they sold the colony of Berbice to a group of investors from Amsterdam who started a joint stock company called the Society of Berbice, and they ran the colony until the late 1700s when it went back when it became a colony run by the Dutch state. And so on the so-called wild coast of South America, the Dutch had the colony of Suriname, which didn't become Dutch until the 1660s when it was swapped for New Netherland with the English. But then Berbice, Demerara, and Essequibo were three colonies that later became British Guyana in the 19th century. And those are the colonies about which I'm talking in the book. Particularly, I'm talking about the Berbice River, where this big rebellion broke out.
And let me, as we continue, let me hold up a copy of the book so that people can see it. And you just mentioned that the book also is being translated into Dutch. So
yes.
Speaking people will be able to have easy access to it. Dutch, English, thank you very much. There were, I would assume, many slave rebellions in that area of the world. We're very familiar, or many people are familiar with the Haitian Rebellion, which began in 1791. The Berbice Rebellion began in 1763. Why did it attract your attention as opposed to what probably was and were other slave uprisings in that region?
Well, to tell you the truth, I initially did not start out to write about a slave rebellion. I had finished a book about a farmers' uprising in North Carolina on the eve of the American Revolution, and I wanted to do something that would bring me in the summers to the Netherlands as opposed to Raleigh, North Carolina to do research. And so I thought, I will go to the archives in The Hague and I'll just start looking around, see what I can find. I'm an Atlantic historian, surely there is something I can study there. And immediately I found all these records about a place called Berbice, which I had never heard about, having been trained in the United States. And then within those records about this place called Berbice, I found all these records about a slave uprising. And I had studied the African diaspora in graduate school. I realized that I had never heard of this rebellion, but I quickly realized that actually it was huge. And that because most rebellions were suppressed in a matter of hours, sometimes days, this rebellion went on for more than a year. And the enslaved pretty much, they actually almost won. It was an incredibly successful rebellion. And the reason we haven't heard about it is because the records are in Dutch, which until recently Dutch scholars were more interested in the East Indies and not so interested in the West Indies. And if they were interested in the West Indies, they were interested in Suriname. And American scholars who have been very interested in issues having to do with slavery and slave rebellions didn't know until quite recently how to read Dutch. That's beginning to change now. More and more American graduate students are learning Dutch because the records are so rich. So I pretty quickly realized that I had this amazing source base and that there was nothing written about this rebellion, no book about it. The last book that discussed it at great length was from the 19th century. And so being interested in the history of slavery, interested in the history of the African diaspora, is interested in Dutch history, I thought this is a perfect topic to not only bring Guyana to the attention of English speakers, but if I can get this book translated, bring it to the attention of people in the Netherlands, where the discussions about slavery were then only just beginning. So I thought I can actually make an important contribution to social issues of today.
Well, I think you're doing that from what I've heard and read about this book. I'd like to set help us create a picture of what life was like in Berbice during the time that the Dutch were there. You mentioned, of course, that Dutch planters had come to grow sugar and I assume other commodities and to ship them to the Netherlands and maybe other parts of the world. The Dutch West India Company, I assume, had a great role in the development of these commodities. I wonder if you could describe for us what life was like for the enslaved people who were in Berbice at that time, as well as the Dutch colonists who were there.
Sure. The West India Company played a relatively small role in Berbice because they had farmed out the management of the colony first to this family from Zeeland, which is a province in the Netherlands, as I'm sure your members know. And then it became the property of this private company. The West India Company was involved in shipping enslaved or captives from West Africa to Berbice. But they could never bring people in the numbers that the Dutch colonists wanted. Berbice was always a small colony. They grew coffee there from the 1720s on. They grew cocoa, they grew cotton, and actually only the big companies that were owned by the Society of Berbice grew sugar, because sugar required a lot of investment. And so on the eve of this rebellion, there are only about 350 Europeans in Berbice, perhaps 4,500 to 5,000 enslaved Africans, and another 350 or so indigenous enslaved people.
Kars, could I interrupt you? Could you give us a sense of how large Berbice is?
Berbice is a large colony in the sense that the plantations were built on both sides of the river, both banks of the river, over a distance of about 100 miles. So the colony starts about 30 miles inland. This has to do with flood control, and then stretches in this long string about 100 miles, which helps explain why when the enslaved people rebel, the Dutch panic. Because in a long colony like that, when a rebellion breaks out in the middle, everybody living south of that place was thinking, all the white people were thinking, how are we going to get out? And so it's not a very wealthy colony, which means that enslaved people are brutally exploited. They live mostly on small plantations. The largest plantations are those owned by the company. Those are maybe 100, 120 people. But many folks lived on plantations with 40, 30, or even 10 people, which creates a difficulty in terms of creating a community, finding people to marry, and so on. So there was a lot of visiting at night between plantations that enslaved people did. Enslaved people came in large numbers from what is now Ghana, what was then called the Gold Coast. Some came from Senegambia, so a little bit further north. Others came from what is now West Central Africa, Congo, for instance. So people came from different regions, brought different ethnic identities with them. And in Guyana, it appears that those ethnic identities remained important, just as they were for the first and second generation Italians or Irish in North America. And that people used some of those connections to help organize themselves in what became this massive rebellion that broke out in February of 1763.
What were the forces that promoted this rebellion at that particular time? What was going on? What were the pressures?
Well, the pressures were that the 7 Years' War was about to end. That ends in 1763. The 7 Years' War fought between Britain and England, but it's fought around the world. So it's really the First World War in many ways, and it interrupted shipping. Berbice was not self-sufficient, so people relied on food from Holland. And because those ships were slow in coming because of the fighting, there was a lot of hunger. And of course, enslaved people suffered that the most. There were also a series of epidemics. We're not quite sure what they were, but they involved fevers. And people were dying in large numbers, not only the Europeans, but also enslaved people. And this meant both that the Europeans were weaker than usual. They were already not that powerful, as you imagine. They were hugely outnumbered. But they had the army behind them, but soldiers had been dying. There were only about 100 soldiers in Berbice. And the remaining planters were likely stepping up their exploitation of their enslaved workers to make up for production that was decreasing because of shrinking numbers. So hunger seems to have been the first immediate cause, other than enslavement itself, of course, which people always rebelled against and resisted as much as they could and as much as they dared.
The leaders of the rebellion have been described in some cases as not fixed on what a future could be for them and the enslaved people. Kofi, in particular, who was one of the major leader, is said to have wanted to create a society after the rebellion, much like the society that the Dutch had created. And I wonder if you could talk about this. What did the leaders, at least, and even their followers, believe would happen to them? What kind of vision did they have of their future after a rebellion?
Well, the Berbice rebellion is fascinating because it lasted so long. and because the records are amazing. There are 900 interrogations of people that were taken by the Dutch after the rebellion was finally suppressed in the spring of 1764, so more than a year after it started. And the leader of the rebellion, who called himself Governor Kofi, also wrote letters to the Dutch governor, basically trying to negotiate a non-military ending. So the sources allow us to see what enslaved people were after in a way that for most rebellions we don't know because they were over so quickly. And so out of those letters and out of those interrogations, we get a picture that is actually quite complex. So in his letters, Kofi basically says to the Dutch governor, let's divide this colony in two. You are hanging on there by your fingernails close to the coast. I'm basically in charge of the rest of the colony. I'm willing to give you half. You keep the half that is closer to the ocean. I will keep the half that is closer to the rest of South America. I will do in my half what I want, and you can do in your half what you want. But we are going to be free people. But it is at the same time also clear that Kofi wants to participate in the world market, that he intends to sell products on the world market. And what we learned from these interrogations and other sources is that particularly the people on the company plantations, many of whom were second, third, fourth generation Guyanese by then, were forced by the rebels to grow sugar, partly because Kofi wanted, I think, to have sugar to trade, but also because that created the rum with which many of the soldiers were rewarded. And so it's clear that as West Africans, where a very different form of slavery existed than in the New World, but nevertheless forced labor was quite common, it's quite clear to me that I think Kofi wanted to perpetuate that in some way, in the same way that we see in Haiti after Toussaint Louverture has won, people are forced to stay on their plantations and work. It's very hard in the 18th century to think about participating in world capitalism and create agricultural products without some form of forced labor, because nobody wants to work in the tropics creating sugar. People want to have their own little plots of land. And so what I see is that Kofi and his fellow leaders have one vision, but many of the ordinary people have a different vision. They want to be free, for sure, but they're not sure they want to be part of this rebellion where they might be forced to work, where they might be forced to create food for the rebels even. It's clear that people want to live and create and keep working their own little plots of land, which they had under the Dutch, and have their independence. And so the intellectual history of African descended people comes through, that there are different ways of thinking about what this revolution is going to look like, just like the American Revolution, where the founding fathers often had a very different vision from many of the ordinary people who lived in the colonies, who wanted much more independence and an economic level playing field, for instance.
That leads me to this question. The Berbice Rebellion began in 1763.
Yeah.
The American Rebellion began in 1765. The Haitian Rebellion began in 1791. I hope it's not too big of a question, but what do these rebellions, or what did they have in common? And what have we learned from the things that they have in common?
Well, historians often talk about the age of revolution, seeing it as beginning at the end of the 7 Years' War. So I would say that the Berbice Rebellion kind of kicks off this age of revolution, and that it moves through the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and then the wars for Latin American independence in the 18-teens and 1820s. And what we see in all of these rebellions, and it's not just these big revolutions, but there are also a large number of rebellions by enslaved people, by ordinary farmers. What we see is a desire to create a world in which people will not be exploited, in which people will have more autonomy, more say, in which people get to keep the products of their own labor. And so for the founding fathers, that means no longer being part of the British Empire and having the independence to set up their own government and make their own trade relations. For many ordinary people, it means no longer being enslaved, for instance, or no longer having to pay high rents to a landlord, or no longer being forced to pay really high taxes. And so we see throughout this period that people are trying to create better lives for themselves, but that elites and ordinary people don't necessarily define that in the same way. And we also see that despite the fact that there are many enslaved people fighting against slavery, and despite the fact that, for instance, in the United States, in the North, there's gradual abolition, in other places, slavery becomes, in fact, more entrenched in this age of revolution. In Berbice, for instance, when the rebellion is finally put down, the Dutch go right back to having slavery. New people are imported to make up for the many folks who died in the rebellion. And once Berbice becomes British, in the early 19th century, Guyana briefly becomes a real jewel in the crown of the British Empire, with huge numbers of enslaved people being imported and forced to create sugar. So it's a real mixed period. It's a period of tremendous intellectual ferment, of tremendous courage on the part of large numbers of people trying to create something better. But it's also a period in which many people see their hopes dashed.
One of your areas of expertise is women in transatlantic studies. And I wonder if you could describe for us what you've learned about the role of women in these slave rebellions in particular, but in general, in the way in which the enslaved people were, the way in which the enslaved people's cultures were maintained, I assume, in many cases by women.
Yes, and I think that recent scholarship really shows the crucial role of African descended women in passing on their cultures, in keeping families together, in fighting to give what they could to their children under the most horrific circumstances, where parents and children were routinely separated, where people could not control what happened to their kids, where kids could be sold away from their parents and frequently were, where women had to deal with sexual abuse all the time on the part of overseers and owners. So under quite horrific circumstances. What I see in the rebellion is a number of different things. There are a number of women who serve as counselors to the male leaders. They advise these men on the loyalty of people. They advise them on how various people who are captured, both Europeans and enslaved people who resisted the rebels, how they should be punished, whether they should be punished. And many of these women are related through marriage or birth or through fictive kin, meaning that they build up relationships on the slave ships coming over, and those relationships people forged under those horrific conditions were very strong. And so these women have kin relations to these male leaders. So the positions within the rebel leadership are all held by men. So the captains, the military officers, the men who set up the government, the rebels' government, but women have these less official positions as counselors. Women also support the rebellion, of course, by cooking for soldiers, by supporting the soldiers, by healing the soldiers, by birthing new babies, and so on and so forth. But we also see that women have a tougher time in the rebellion. Men, of course, run military risks, but sometimes women are taken from their plantation by rebel leaders, and rebel leaders give women to their soldiers as a reward. So women serve to some extent as booty. Women don't have the same opportunities as men to rise in the ranks. And so in many ways, I think that armed rebellion, because it is a military conflict, is less emancipatory for women than it is for men. And so women are positioned in different ways in this rebellion, sometimes as very active supporters, sometimes as supporters that are less visible, but there are also quite a few women who make clear that they kind of wanted to stay clear of this rebellion, that they didn't want their children involved, they didn't want their sons dying, they didn't want slavery. But that doesn't mean that they were willing to fight in what many people probably assumed was going to be a fight they could not win. And the rebels would have won had it not been for the fact that they have no allies. Nobody is sending them guns from Europe. The Native Americans are mostly fighting on the side of the Europeans. They can't get new medication, they can't get new guns, they can't get new food. Whereas the Dutch are very much resupplied, of course, by the Dutch army and the Dutch state. Had the Berbice rebels been able to find allies, then I think Berbice would have been the first Haiti, and it would have been the first independent republic, and everybody would know Governor Kofi's name.
Well, a lot of people do know his name.
In Guyana, they do.
In Guyana, yes.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Right. Yeah. I wonder, what tools, what armaments did Kofi and his soldiers have to fight with, to fight the Dutch? What was their knowledge of large-scale fighting to begin with?
Well, their knowledge would have been quite extensive. Kofi identifies as an Amina, which is a sort of a diasporic ethnic group of people who would have come from a similar area in West Africa, what the Dutch called the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana, which was a very powerful state at the time with a very large army. And so many of the first generation Africans who joined Kofi would have had a lot of military experience, which is partly why they probably were so successful. One of the first things the rebels do is take over military places where the Dutch were putting their guns together for their militia. So the idea is that they have maybe 400 guns, which is not a lot. So multiple men would have used one gun together. And other than that, they would have used agricultural implements, knives. But I have also read stories about once the Dutch soldiers do finally arrive from the Dutch Republic in January of 1764, that in skirmishes, rebels would come and take the guns right out of the hands of these fairly hapless Dutchmen who were not used to fighting in the tropics, who were afraid of the jungle. The heat was too much for them. They had no good maps. They couldn't use their compass because the jungle obscured their vision of the sun. These men were not trained for jungle warfare, and in battle after battle after battle, they can't really defeat the rebels, and so a number of guns fall into the hand of the rebels that way. But in the end, they do run out of guns, and they do run out of powder and bullets. And that is a real issue for them.
What would have happened? You mentioned that if the rebels had won, what would have happened to the Dutch?
Well, I think that it is, had the rebels won, I think the Dutch would have repeatedly tried to get the colony back. in the 1760s because it was so next door to Suriname. And I think they would have been so afraid to allow Berbice to be an independent republic out of fear that it would spread. Suriname is a much larger colony, 80,000 enslaved people there. And so that would have been hard for them. I think by the 1790s, when Haiti happens, there is a different ideology already a little bit about abolition. The French Revolution already creates different notions about whether slavery should continue or not. So the French try very hard to get their colony back, but Haiti's just too big. 500,000 enslaved, formerly enslaved people fight the French army there. Berbice is small. So I think even if Kofi had won, I'm not sure that it could have been a colony, an independent state that could have lasted for a very long time. He would have had amazing allies for that to happen, and that just did not exist. What you see in Haiti is that because the Spanish and the French are fighting, the Haitian rebels get some help from the Spanish. But I don't think in the 1760s there would have been any European power willing to help the rebels in Berbice. So in a way, they're ahead of their time. And they're at the beginning of this revolutionary period. And ultimately, they're too small a group, I think. So had they won, and the Dutch would and other Europeans would have come back, then maybe they would have been able to disperse into the hinterlands. But unlike in Suriname, in Berbice, native peoples are quite powerful, and they don't want large maroon societies in their territory because it's competition for resources, it's competition for women. And they want to trade with the Dutch themselves for indigenous slaves. So slavery as an institution hems in these folks on every level, really.
After the rebellion was put down by the Dutch, what happened to the rebels? What happened to the Africans?
Well, the Dutch have these sham trials where they question people, interrogate them. They're mostly looking for, because they are Dutch, they're sort of parsimonious, and particularly the company is like, let's not kill too many people. I think people have learned their lesson. We just want you to execute the real leaders, but not the followers, because we want the colony back in production. The planters think a little bit differently about that. And so 125 people are executed in rather gruesome ways, among them 4 women. They are burned at the stake, they are hanged, which is the most merciful of deaths, or they are broken on the wheel. And then slavery is reimposed, and plantations are put back to the extent that the Dutch can. About 1/3 of them are really destroyed, and many of the owners want to sell their properties, but they're not worth much, because without enslaved laborers, these properties are useless. And so it takes a while. The Dutch state pumps large amounts of money into Berbice, money that they never recoup. And it's one of the reasons that eventually by the 1790s, the Dutch state says, you know, we cannot continue to pump money into these private companies that run colonies that are too big to fail, but the companies are too small to really pay for it themselves. And so we're constantly on the hook to help them out when their own cruel behavior creates these rebellions. And so the Dutch state tries to say, you know, you guys have to treat people better, but you know, even slavery, even with a human face, remains slavery. It's a system that can only work with violence, because if you're not paying people, there is no other way to make them work. And so the enslaved are put back to work. People had sustained enormous losses. Between 1/5 and 1/3 of the enslaved people do not survive this rebellion, either because they were killed in battle, they died of disease, they died of hunger, deprivation. Some were taken to other colonies, so some of them were no longer there because of that reason. And the colony resumes. So in that respect, it's not an uplifting story, other than this continued resistance, not only in Berbice, but also in Suriname, eventually convinces the Dutch state that they have to get involved in colonialism directly. And not long after that, of course, Berbice, Demerara, and Essequibo are conquered by the English and eventually become British.
You've been to Berbice in your travels and in your studies.
Yes.
How can you describe what Berbice is like today, and if it's possible for you to imagine what impact that slave rebellion had on the Berbice of this moment in history?
That's a tough question. The Berbice River is, many of the old plantations no longer exist, but their names live on. So these pieces of land are often still known by the names of plantations that they had in the 17th and 18th century. And in fact, when I took an 18th century map and I put it on a modern map, there was amazing overlap. I was there 15 years ago, so I think things have evolved. But when I was there, the great majority of people lived in houses right by the river on stilts, built to catch the winds, because there was no electricity other than what people, there was no electricity, so people relied on the winds to keep their houses cool. Everybody had little dugout canoes in which they traveled up and down the river. Fewer people live on the Berbice River now than did during the 18th century. And when I took boat rides up and down the river, the man whose boat it was knew everybody who lived on the river. Not all the children, he said, but all the adults. And wherever we would come by a house, he would wave, and people would come and onto the veranda to see who went by. People were not keen to talk about this rebellion, and that may well be because I was white and a European. So I had trouble finding out how much people really knew about it. I mean, obviously there's a big commemoration of Kofi in Georgetown. There's a big statute. And I think people learn about it in school for sure. But that doesn't mean that people know a whole lot. I mean, Americans know about the American Revolution, but they don't know all the ins and outs. And so I think when I gave talks online in Guyana, people were both extremely interested to hear more, but they also felt like, how come these records are in The Hague? Why are they not here? Why is this sort of colonial situation in a way still continuing? And I must say that the Dutch archives have digitized all these records. They're all online now. They're also going to translate part of these records about the rebellion into English, so it's easier for Guyanese, who are all English speakers, to read them. But I'm sort of hoping that as part of reparations, the Dutch might want to train young Guyanese history students to read Dutch and to look at the original documents, because reading it in the original Dutch is never the same as reading it in translation. Because while I think I did a good job in my book, people need to write about their own history. And Guyanese folks need to study this rebellion and come to their own conclusions about it. So while I hope, of course, that my book will be the book for a while, I also hope that eventually there will be more books about this rebellion, a number of them written by Afro-Guyanese.
You mentioned reparatory issues, which is, of course, a big subject in the United States and all around the world,
Yes.
and especially in the Caribbean, because the Caribbean community, CARICOM, has proposed and is now working on an effort to get the former colonizers of the Caribbean, including the Dutch, to apologize for their role in slavery, as well as to take part in reparatory programs undo the negative impact of slavery over the last 300-400 years. Isn't it, I would think it's very important for people to know the history of these small places like Berbice, because they have a commanding role in the history of slavery in the New World. And because you can see, at least I believe it's possible, to see, and as you have documented, the impact that slavery had on these societies. So I wonder if you don't mind talking a little bit about how you feel about reparatory justice. And I use the term reparatory justice instead of reparations, because I believe that of those two words, justice is the most important. How would you talk a little bit about your feelings, having done all this research into slavery in the Caribbean as well as in North America?
Sure. Of course, historians, I think, play a role in such issues, not so much in terms of their own opinions, but in terms of providing the materials from which people who make decisions and activists can understand how deep the history of slavery has influenced not only, of course, Guyana and other countries in the Western Hemisphere, but the Netherlands itself. And there is a big discussion in the Netherlands about this at the moment, with one prominent historian arguing that slavery was not all that important, but many younger historians, and even though I'm not younger, I would consider myself among them, who argue that the impact of slavery on Dutch society has been great. Not only certainly economically, but also in terms of the development of racism, in terms of how the Dutch saw themselves, in terms of how colonialism has shaped Dutch culture to this day, really. And several Dutch cities have now begun, they're paying for researchers to do research into the role of slavery and the slave trade in the development of these cities. Amsterdam has just concluded one of those, and we were briefly talking before this program that the mayor of Amsterdam has just publicly apologized on behalf of the city of Amsterdam to descendants of enslaved people for Amsterdam's role in slavery and the slave trade. She did that on the day that the Netherlands celebrate the end of slavery and emancipation in the Caribbean. And now The Hague is starting such a research. Rotterdam has already started it. Utrecht just completed a research like that. So it's really an issue in the Netherlands. And it seems to me that reparatory justice is really needed, whatever form it may take, and that is something that people need to discuss. But even repatriating records is a small part of it. Making people's own history accessible to them is a part of it. Apologizing is a part of it. Reckoning with slavery is a part of it. For people, white people, to realize the role that slavery has played in the history of the Netherlands, and how deep that role has gone, and the way in which it still shapes race relations and racism in the Netherlands. And I think that is going to be a long discussion, but one that we have to keep pushing because it's absolutely crucial. And it's the same in the United States, of course. But I do think we're actually a little bit further ahead in the US than we are in the Netherlands.
Oh, how so? Why do you think that?
Because in the United States, first of all, enslaved people have been part of the United States since the very beginning. The great majority of African Americans' roots go back to the colonial period, whereas the majority of white Americans, their roots only go back to the late 19th or 20th century. Whereas in the Netherlands, until quite recently, The number of descendants of enslaved people in the Netherlands itself was very small, so people could kind of externalize slavery, or that was something that happened in the colonies and therefore didn't really involve people in the Netherlands itself. So that is one. And I think that Black scholars in the Netherlands are showing in their writings that Dutch people have for a long time really have been very invested in this notion of themselves as very tolerant. This notion that racism is an American problem, that doesn't happen in Dutch society, and it's simply not true. And I think that now that larger numbers of African descended people are living in the Netherlands, and also people of color coming from the East Indies, who are now speaking to white folks and saying, let us tell you what it is like to live here. Let us tell you what microaggression is all about. Let us tell you what it means to go to school with a curriculum that does not include us. Let us talk about the fact that there are so few people of color in Dutch universities, and on and on and on. And so I think that the Dutch are going to have to reckon with this in a way that some people are excited about and many others are resistant to.
We hope that we have some questions, but let me stop for a moment to do a little commercial for you. This is your book. You've seen it before. It's a fascinating book. And I must tell you that I read many of the reviews of the book, including reviews from Guyana. And they give you great credit for your scholarship and for the detail with which you write. And I think that that's marvelous. So I really thank you for the book on behalf of all of us who are interested in this subject. And I really thank you for being with us today. We've got a few questions, I hope. I see, can we get, let me ask you this question. Can you please tell us a little more about the background of Kofi?
Yes, well, surprisingly enough, Kofi is all over the records and he is nowhere in the records. So I know that he more than likely came to Guyana as a small boy. So he was both African born but highly assimilated. So had a foot in both worlds. He identified as Amina, as did many of the leaders of this rebellion. Those folks were identified as Coromantee among the English, and they are behind many of the slave rebellions in the Caribbean and in the New World, in part because probably of their military background and expertise, as well as the fact that they came from strong states, so they had a lot of experience in governing. But I don't know whether he was married. I don't know whether he had children. We do know that people from the Gold Coast would have only elected him as their leader, chosen him as their leader if he was highly charismatic. People called him wise. Even some Europeans talked about what an incredibly capable man he was. But he commits suicide in the fall of 1763 when there is dissension in his ranks and a number of his lieutenants do not agree with him trying to negotiate with the Dutch. They don't trust the Dutch. They just want to fight. They believe more in their guns than in the pen. And among people of that part of the west coast of West Africa, when you lose the support of your most important lieutenants, then the honorable thing is to get yourself out of the way. So Kofi does that. And the Dutch don't ask much about them in these interrogations. They want to know who killed Europeans, who set fire to buildings, and who was a rebel leader. And other than that, they are very uninterested in how people organized, what they were after. And so the questions they ask are very pointed. And when people begin to answer other things, the clerk will just summarize it by saying, he said a lot of other things that aren't relevant. So we don't know as much about him as we would like.
So the Dutch interrogations tended to focus on what they considered to be the criminal behavior of the
That's
rebels.
right. They were eager to figure out whom they wanted to execute, and then send everybody else back to the plantations as soon as they could.
It's got another question for you. Do you know, do you have information on Ata and Akabre? What were their roles in the relation to Kofi?
Well, Ata is the man who succeeds Kofi, also an Amina. He becomes, after some infighting, the next governor of Berbice. But he has many other important leaders who don't necessarily agree with him. Akabire is one of them. And so after the death of Kofi, under the stress of not having enough food, not having enough guns, as well as political disagreements, increasingly the rebels disagree with each other, and what had been a relatively unified leadership begins to fall apart, where individual leaders take off with their own followers. And so Akabire, Akara, Ata are all subsequent leaders after Kofi dies. And I tried to find out as much as I could about them in the book. I'm at the moment working on a sort of a follow-up book about two of those leaders who at some point betrayed a rebellion, joined the Dutch, eventually, when the rebellion is completely crushed, are taken to the Netherlands, where they work in the Dutch army for 7 years, and eventually these men go to Suriname, where they end up joining the Dutch army that fights Maroons, which are runaway slaves who form their own independent communities in the hinterlands. And I'm very interested in these men who are both heroes because they are rebel leaders, but then also make choices to save themselves, more than likely, that we would see as less than heroic. And I'm interested in how, like all of us, we combine heroism with cowardice, and we combine courage with treachery, and how these various roles play themselves out, particularly in the lives of men who have so few choices available to them. So there are a number of these different leaders. I think some would rather be Maroons, some still hold on to that dream of Kofi, and some are more authoritarian than others, and they jockey for position, and their followers sometimes follow them, sometimes join others. It becomes as much a civil war as it is a war against the Europeans.
Another question. Could you talk about how people became enslaved in West Africa before they were traded across the ocean?
Well, people became enslaved by the 18th century, often in wars that were partly fought among African leaders, partly exacerbated by the stresses of the international slave trade, Europeans being eager to buy such captives. What do you call that? Getting involved in African politics. So many people were caught in wars and then sold in as captives to the coast and taken from there to the New World. Small numbers of people might, just like in England in the 18th century, convict people who were convicted of a crime, even a minor crime, could choose to be executed or go to the colonies. Something similar happens in West Africa. People can either be put to death or they can be sold as captives. Very few people are sometimes ransomed by their families for various reasons, but the great majority of people are war captives who are in raids or in wars, are taken captives and then sold to the coast, from where they are sold to Europeans.
No, I want to conclude with by quoting you. In the epilogue of your book, you conclude by saying, the human will for even a margin of freedom, it seems, does not die easily. And I think that's quite profound and quite accurate. Uh, Tell us a little bit about what's next for you, Professor Kars. You mentioned something more about Berbice, but you also, I know, are involved in a huge issue uh, involving the United States. What kind of books are you working on?
Yeah, well, I'm helping to edit with two other people a massive history of the American Revolution for Cambridge University Press. And it was really my interest in the American Revolution that when I saw these records about Berbice, I thought, why do we always study slave rebellion as if they are in a category all their own, when really enslaved people like poor farmers, like mine workers, like agricultural laborers everywhere want better lives. And so I was surprised, but also not surprised to see that the same sort of issues that you see in the American Revolution, you see in Berbice. Different ideological views, leaders fighting with each other, elites having different views than ordinary people, and so on and so forth. So I continue to be interested in that. And so I'm working on that for the American Revolution. I'm working on this short book, I hope, about these two men, Akara and Gusari, who I can trace in Berbice from the 1740s, and then the last mention of Akara is in the early 1800s. So this man lives more than 70 years. So I'm very interested in that. And after that, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do next. I have vaguely an idea about a project in a totally different century, so I don't even want to talk about it yet. But I think that Berbice will always remain on the radar. The records there are so rich, and so much work remains to be done, not only about African descended people, but also about Native people. And also the relationships among African descended people and indigenous people who lived on the same plantations together. Whenever you read stories about what happened with enslaved people, there's inevitably a Native enslaved person there too. There is so much for us to learn about those very rich records. So I'm also really hoping to inspire other people to go take a look at them.
Well, I think you're succeeding on that point, certainly.
Thank you very much.
I think you've inspired a lot of people, and I think that all these subjects are so fascinating to all of us now. And thank you so much for helping to expand our knowledge of this history. I really think you've done a fabulous job, and I'm not being paid to tell you this, but this is a great book, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And Professor Kars, thank you for adding so much to our knowledge of these very important subjects, and also for helping us to understand that all human beings have a desire to be free.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes. And on behalf of the Netherland-America Foundation, I want to thank Professor Kars, and also want to thank all of you for taking part in this discussion.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. Goodbye.